Okay, welcome to the Inside Real Estate Strategy Session webinar for October 29th, 2020. Up on the screen, I have our replays page. It's at insiderealestate.com/webinars. So you can always hop over here and see all the latest episodes. We did a couple earlier this week about webinars that I've got some nice feedback on. I figured today, I kind of had this plan for a while. A friend of mine is going to be on as a guest. And it's a kind of a nice follow-up to what we've been talking about. We talked about webinars the last few days, and I have Michael Sharkey on today. Who is a podcasting guy. I'll give you a little bit about Michael because I know, he's was in the radio industry for a long time. And I think, Michael, for the last, 5 years or so, you've been pretty focused on podcasting. Is that right?
Yeah, since really 2012 when I was still in radio, but I made the shift full time to the podcast space about 2014, early 2015.
Cool. So, I thought it'd be fun to have you on. I think some members of our audience, I think we did one a few years back, something similar on this topic. Might remember you. But I thought, this all falls in line with the idea of creating engaging content that more or less generates a really, really warm lead. And webinars like the one we're doing right now and podcasts are really good mediums for that.
Absolutely.
So you've put together some slides here. They're wonderful. I'm going to kind of just let you get started here on the next slide. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and pop it in the chat. And thank you, Joanna, for sharing your podcast. I'll definitely check that out. So go ahead, Michael.
Awesome. Well, I mean, I think, the very first thing would be to answer the question, kind of what you said a moment ago, Ryan, why? Why would we do a real estate podcast right now as opposed to maybe some other ways of content creation? And I think what you need to know about a podcast is, and really like the moment is now, is that coming in and getting a podcast, when people hear you from their perspective, you are immediately sort of propelled into that position of authority. You are immediately given credibility. So having worked with real estate agents in the past on doing podcasts, whether it be, trying to establish, their value in a marketplace, when you want to get to that position of authority quick, a podcast does that. And that has a lot to do with how people listen. Oftentimes when people listen to a podcast, if done, sort of what we'll go through today, sort of done in that right way, is it establishes credibility because there's an intimacy that comes with it. So a person listening to you talk about maybe, something that's happening in your market, or if you're talking to investors, you are automatically going to be sort of catapulted to that place of authority. And the other thing with podcasts is they're very easy, much, and I hope I can kind of show that to you today, is that they're not challenging. I think a lot of people want to get caught up in the tech side of it or the software side of it. And the truth of the matter is they're very easy to produce and they're very easy to publish, which again, I'm going to show you today. And it gives you access to what you do in your business to brand new places. Most specifically is if you can imagine having your real estate business in Spotify. Well, with a podcast, you can, and you can be in Apple Podcasts as well. So let's jump into really the 5 steps that I kind of put together for everybody today.
Yeah, Michael, can I interject just a little bit? Because I had a question pop up in my head and I wondered if other people were wondering, how many people, what do the numbers look like? Like in our local market, you live in St. Pete where I do. In a normal metro area, how many people are listening to podcasts? What's the potential in a hyperlocal business like real estate?
It's interesting because it's growing every day. I mean, so a lot of the numbers that I look at are sort of like national perception, that sort of thing. But I'll give you an example. I have a client who just started her podcast about a month ago. She's based out of Phoenix, Arizona. Actually, I'm sorry, she's more targeted to the Tempe, Arizona area. And she's getting between 200 and 500 downloads every episode. So right out of the gate, and all she did for what she was doing is, and she's not in real estate, she's in a different vertical, but what she was doing was just really using her Instagram, just kind of the basic, using her email list. And she didn't have a big email list, but what she noticed is that people immediately were like, hey, I love your podcast. They were giving her ratings and reviews, and it grew really quick, where now it's opening up to people who are saying, hey, I heard about you from so-and-so when you interviewed them on the podcast. I'd like to be on your podcast, or I'd like to, come down. She does business photography. Yep. So, that's a good example from somebody who's just getting started.
So, and then from my experience, I'm kind of like I'm kind of more of a YouTube guy in terms of consuming content, but I will, there's a few podcasts I check in on frequently. From what I've seen, people who are into podcasts really just, that's like a medium. if they find a new podcast, it goes in the rotation, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's really a thing that I've observed, kind of, as you said at the beginning, coming from the radio space. And then for the last 5, 6 years, what's happening in the growth of podcast is that when people talk about podcast, it's like it changed their life. It's like, oh my gosh, I just found this new podcast about real estate or business coaching or life coaching or whatever. And that gets back to that intimacy. When people find a podcast that they love, it's like the host is talking only to them, which makes it so powerful.
So in real estate, if you could just get 100 people local who have you in their loop, like it doesn't need to be a huge number, just you have 100 regular listens. Every time a new episode goes live, they notice it and they check it out because you're doing something engaging and local. Yes. That can generate some really nice leads and ripple out into referrals and awareness. But I would guess, I'm just making some assumptions, but it wouldn't be too hard to get to 1,000 if your metro area has a few million people.
I mean, I think it literally would be this, the example I gave a minute ago was Tempe, Arizona. So basically the Phoenix metro. But she's really focused on that part, which is, the comparable to St. Pete to Tampa. But, I mean, the larger the metro, but even then smaller the metro, it's still, you're going to get the same sort of high passion qualified leads.
Cool. So I'll stop interrupting you and let you go into the next slide here.
Yeah, this is to kind of set up what we're going to talk about today. These 5 simple steps. I really try to keep it as simple as sort of, number one, you got to get the equipment right. And I'll explain to you why sounding good is important. Making your podcast unique will be the second step we talk about. Number 3 is knowing exactly who you're talking to and why that's important. 4 is going to be the ease of getting your podcast on iTunes or Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And then finally, how you can tell the world. And that's really it. And like I said, I'm going to give you an opportunity at the very end for a free workshop that you can come to my website and check that out. And that's going to dive even deeper into this. But for today, I just kind of want you to, you could take today's information and go start your podcast within the next week. That's kind of my goal with this, but there'll be an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper. So jumping into the first one. Here's what you need to understand about the right equipment. First of all, if you do not use the right equipment, so a lot of people will, you can start a podcast in a half hour using your iPhone and a software called Anchor or an app called Anchor. And that's not a bad thing, but understand that when people listen to podcasts, oftentimes what they're listening to is they're going to listen to a Joe Rogan or they're going to listen to a Tim Ferriss or some big, highly produced podcast. And then if they come to your podcast and there is an appreciable difference in quality, they are less likely to listen. And oftentimes that fatigue will cause them to not listen and not come back. So bad quality, unfortunately, gets you to a place with no listeners. Now, the flip side of that is you can sound like a professional, very easy and very inexpensive.
You helped me do this, right? It wasn't that much money.
No, I think your setup was like $100, maybe $130 for the microphone that I recommended and the mixer. But really, that's what you're trying to do. A lot of people, you could walk into a Best Buy right now and buy what is a microphone that is a USB microphone. So just as it sounds, it goes into the USB jack in your computer. Those microphones by design will pick up every noise in your room, in your studio, in your office. What I recommend are dynamic microphones. So I'm talking on a dynamic microphone right now. So you're not hearing the fact that my dog is scratching in the other room or that my wife is running around the house. And they're really inexpensive. You can get a good dynamic microphone in the $35 to $40 range, a good cable, and then a USB interface. And what I'll do, Ryan, is at the end, I can put up a quick studio checklist that I have where you can see all this equipment. Bottom line is you don't need to spend a lot of money to get an equipment that rivals another podcast host like a Tim Ferriss or a Joe Rogan who might be using, say, a $500,000 or $1 million studio, and I know that sounds crazy, but for $150, your studio can sound as good as somebody who's spending $500,000. And that's just the truth. And that's the reality of it.
I'll get your resource list in the comments. I mean, in the description wherever the replay shows on YouTube. So I've seen that. Now I'll make sure that's posted up there.
Okay. But yeah, bottom line is it's easy, it's inexpensive, it's not challenging. And most, because I talk to a lot of people who are starting podcasts every single day, this is the first question. Wow. I don't know the equipment to buy. It's too much. No, it's not. It's actually about a 5-minute process. You can go through it. You can get it for less than a couple $100 and your studio can sound just like Ryan, just like what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think I clicked the links on your site and just bought, put together the package on Amazon. It was here in a few days.
Yeah, it's super easy and super inexpensive.
Cool. Go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the big thing that I hear, and this is really step 2, is about making your real estate podcast unique. Like, what is it that is going to make your podcast different from everyone else? And a lot of people that I talk to say, hey, look, I don't think my podcast is going to sound special, therefore I'm not going to start it. And I would tell you that no matter who you are, no matter what market you're in, no matter what you do, quite honestly, if you've got an idea that is presented from your perspective, it is going to be unique and it's going to be good. Now, because we're specifically talking about real estate podcast, it actually is quite easy for you to sound unique, where your podcast won't sound like everybody else's. Now, I will tell you, you might be in a market where maybe an agent across town has already started one. So watch out for that, because people are jumping in so fast and so quick. That's why there's a sense of urgency. But some examples of markets and ideas that I have worked with specifically with other people in the real estate space in the past, these things work so great. So if you've got a real estate podcast, and I'm just going to use the market that I live in, and Ryan lives in St. Petersburg, Florida, you could, with episodes, do a neighborhood spotlight. What neighborhoods are moving really quick? Is St. Paul versus the old Northeast versus Gulfport. These are local neighborhoods to our area. Huge way to grow your podcast, like lightning fast. Interview local business owners. And especially now with COVID happening, these owners are looking for any way to get their name out. So and back to what I said at the beginning, establishing authority quickly. You walk in with the super cheap equipment that I told you about, or do it over Zoom, depending on the comfort level of people in the world that we're in right now. But a 10-minute interview. How long have you been in business? What's your favorite part about this community? Things like that.
Where do you live?
Where do you live?
Yeah.
Immediately establishes what you do. Now, just by doing those two things, hey, this episode, we're going to spotlight this neighborhood and why it's great. This episode, we're going to talk to the owner of the great Cuban food restaurant or whatever. Just those things make your podcast, with your energy and your desire and your knowledge of the market that you're in, those two things right there are going to give you episodes that are going to make your podcast completely different than anyone else out there. And another example that I think is good is using your podcast maybe every quarter or every month, just to do a quick market update. Especially within real estate, you've got things changing all the time. So it's a great opportunity for you to kind of show, again, that credibility and that authority, your knowledge in your marketplace. Here's what's happening on our local market with real estate. Here's what's selling well. Here's what's on the horizon, things like that.
Yeah, I could see even just doing only neighborhood spotlights and interviewing local business owners. There's 100 episodes in that in any market. And then you could start with the market update or end with the market update in every episode. Do a quick think about what's going on lately.
Yeah. And we won't get too much into that today, but that's exactly right, Ryan. A lot of what I work on with people is episode structure. So just exactly what you said is that you could build into that thing, like when you finish the interview with the person that owns the local store or the local restaurant, end with that sort of like, hey, here's your quick, July or, October 30th market update for your particular real estate market. Absolutely.
Great. I might take a stab at an example interview if you don't. Maybe I'll talk to you after and we'll start one out, and I'll try to record it. Yeah.
Cool. Sounds good.
Cool. So slide 3.
Step 3 is really, this is something where it is all about knowing your audience. And I want to dive a little bit deeper, because if you have your own real estate business or you're an entrepreneur of any sort, no matter what you're dealing with, marketing, email list, or whatever, it's like, you got to know your audience. You got to have an avatar. You got to understand. But the reason why in podcasts, it's so crucial to know your audience is because it is literally who you're talking to. So one of the things that you learn in radio early on, and I teach every person I work with, is that when you do a podcast, you are talking to one person. You never want to get on your podcast and say, hey, everybody out there. Hey, all y'all out there, because then it sounds to the listener like there's no intimacy and that there's really nothing there. But if you understand that what you're talking to is a first-time home buyer, let's say, well, a first-time home buyer might be somebody, new family, late 20s, generally a decision that's probably going to be fueled by the wife as opposed to the husband, and when you're talking to her directly in your podcast about all the great things in your market, she is going to feel like you are only talking to her. And that's where that intimacy comes in. So understanding, and again, it doesn't have to be first-time homebuyers. It can be investors, it can be commercial property. And you could even shift it a little bit within particular episodes, as long as you set the stage at the beginning of the episode. Hey, this episode is all about commercial property in St. Petersburg or what have you. But it's so important to understand when you go into your podcast or into individual episodes, knowing exactly who it is you're talking to, because you are literally, with a podcast, talking to that person. So I always put this in here because knowing your audience gets, like I said, thrown around a lot in a lot of marketing conversations. But in podcasting, if you understand that you're talking to a 29-year-old female who wants to buy her first home with her young family, it allows that level of communication to exist on such an intimate level.
Are you saying to kind of, so if I'm doing a general one with structure that's kind of neighborhood or interviewing local business owners, are you saying to have in mind who I want to work with beforehand and kind of talk with that tone?
Yeah. I mean, it did, and that's why I say you can vary. If you have certain episodes that might be more about, let's say, being an investor or commercial property, you can do that. But yes, initially, if you're interviewing, let's say, the person who owns the great local, Spanish restaurant or the French restaurant, you want to go into that understanding that, there's a 29-year-old person out there who's going to be listening, who's going to want to know about real estate. But now you just gave this person the great new restaurant to go try whenever, whenever that happens in the future. So, and it's not really anything that you have to labor over or, think too much about. It's just really good because when you're doing a podcast, you are physically, literally talking to that one person every time you record an episode.
This just gave me other ideas on the content structure up here in the last slide. Because just to share with everybody, I could see doing a first-time investor. We talked about a first-time investor webinar, buyer, seller. So you could do episodes around specific scenario, use cases, things that people do with real estate and scenarios.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, because everybody, on this webinar and yourself included, you guys are, I know podcast in and out and how to communicate in and out, but real estate in and out. So and understand that how you might talk to a first-time investor is going to be different than a first-time, family home buyer.
Yeah.
And those intricacies come into play when you're going to record your episode. Again, you don't have to overthink it. It would just be no different than if you were having the conversation, because that's really what it is. It's just a conversation with that person in person or over a Zoom call. Instead, you're just recording it in your own studio or in your own home.
Got it. Okay.
So,
step 4.
All right. Step 4, getting your podcast live. So this is a big thing that comes up all the time about like, okay, well, I've got this podcast. I'm really excited about it, but how in the heck do I get it out there? What do I do? This seems so like, is there an approval process? Do they review it? What if they don't like mine? And I'm here to tell you that does not exist and does not exist. And it probably won't ever. It's a very simple thing to do. And I'm going to kind of go backwards on the slide. I'm going to start with what you see at the bottom. Use a hosting platform. So I use Libsyn. And I know I recommended Libsyn to you, Ryan. So if you go to libsyn.com, this is basically what you'll see here is their platform. All they do is they host your podcast. Now, when you go in, it probably takes about 20 minutes when you have your podcast to go set everything up inside. But when you go inside Libsyn and you set everything up initially, what it's going to do is it's going to allow to set up for distribution to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and all the services. Now, I always emphasize Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If your podcast is on either one of those or both of those, you will touch probably 98 to 99% of all people who are listening to podcasts. That's the big thing. But the thing is when you use Libsyn, and it's going to cost you like $10, $12 a month to host your podcast. When you use Libsyn, specifically because of the way the back end works, if you go to Apple Podcasts, it's going to be distributed on other platforms, again, like you see in front of you, such as radio.com, such as Pandora. So first and foremost, Libsyn, Buzzsprout, these services are how you're going to want to host, because that is how your podcast shows up on big platforms like Apple Podcast, like Stitcher, and like Spotify.
So basically, you take the audio file and you upload it here. That's
that's really it. I mean, and if this were a detailed about editing and all that stuff, I'd show you like how you can edit things and how you then save it as an MP3. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds there, but I just want, the goal with this webinar is really to kind of say, okay, look, if you believe that, doing a podcast is challenging and the tech is really hard, I'm here to tell you that it's not. Libsyn probably has over half of all podcasts that are out there. They're sort of the first one in, but there are other services. They all are about the same price and they all do about the same thing. And if you get really, really big and you start to get, growth, these services can also help you with advertising and monetization and things like that. But pretty much you're going to record a file on your computer and you're going to upload it to Libsyn. And then the way the magic things happen on the internet is about 5 minutes later, you'll go on Spotify and you'll find your podcast. The one thing I want to throw in, especially around the conversation around getting your podcast live, is that what you want to think about when the time comes for you and you've made the decision and you're going to do a podcast is I really recommend to everyone who does it, be as consistent as possible. If you tell your audience that you're going to put out a new episode every Monday, then you need to put out a new episode every Monday. Now that might seem daunting and it's like, oh my gosh, I can't do that. That's okay. Tell your audience you're going to put out an episode every other Monday, or do seasons. Here's a 10 episode season, and then you can take 2 months off, and here's another season and another season. And the reason why you want to do that is because most people fail with podcast around consistency. And what ends up happening, it's actually not around consistency as much as it's around, you get a great idea and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to do a podcast. I'm going to start. It's going to be awesome. And the average podcast lasts about 6 episodes. And then the host runs out of steam. So before you get into before you publish that first episode, before you upload to Libsyn, really sort of think about your first 10, 20, 30 episodes. Think about all the people you want to interview. Think about all your potential neighborhood spotlights or market updates so that you are consistent. If you are consistent, you will stand out amongst all the other podcasts. Over 45% of all podcasts never get past the 6th episode.
I made it to 7.
Yeah, but you know what? Here's what I'm gonna say about Ryan. I think you have a great podcast, and I think you should do a couple more episodes and then wrap up your first season, and then you can be consistent. So even in the case of, hey, I did a podcast, I started, and then I didn't update something for like 2 months, you can always come back. You'll always be able to come back. So it's not a big deal as it relates to that. But just do yourself a favor and think about consistency before you actually publish to a Libsyn and then get out to Apple Podcasts.
So kind of have like you helped me get like my first 5, I think it was, topics. So going back to this slide, maybe you would just sketch out the first 10 of the season, right? Say, I'm going to interview these 5 business owners, do these 3 neighborhoods, and
yes, absolutely. Now, I recommend for everybody that I work with to map out your first 30 episodes. And it's not a write down your first 30 and then it's going to be set in stone, but it's more of just sort of a good thing. Like you just said, Ryan, who can I interview? Who can I talk to? I could do these 10 neighborhoods. I could do this interview with these people. And it just, with, sitting down in an Excel sheet for 10 minutes, you could probably come down between 20 and 30 episodes. And then it just kind of gives you a roadmap when the time comes to start recording and then ultimately publishing your podcast.
Got it. Great.
All right. So now the final one, you got to tell the world this is just very basic. When you've made up your mind, you've started recording, always set a launch date. So a lot of people, especially this time of year, they're kind of thinking, okay, maybe I'll start a podcast at the beginning of the year, or work on it now so that you can release it. Set that launch date and tease to that launch date. So if your launch date was, I'm just hypothetically, if it was January 1st, in December, you want to say, hey, while you're doing your Christmas shopping, don't forget to set a reminder because my podcast is coming out the first of the year. And what that does is not only does it give you a great call to action to promote and tease on your networks, but it also kind of gives you some accountability. Once you tell somebody your podcast is coming out on January 1, your podcast is coming out on January 1. And then really promoting to your network. The example I used at the beginning, Tammy from Tempe, Arizona, she had a pretty good Instagram following. And when I say pretty good, she was a few hundred people. It wasn't like she was an Instagram influencer, but she was able to use her Instagram and her under 100 person mailing list to grow her podcast fast. Don't underestimate the power of your own podcast network, and always start there. Doesn't mean you can't. I think, Ryan, you did some Spotify ads with your podcast, and there's other ways that you can promote your podcast, both organic and paid ads. But start with your own network. Start with these people. And the final thing I'll tell you about telling the world and getting your podcast out there is use interviews. So when I said a little while ago, you're going to interview the local restaurant owner, that restaurant owner is now going to be, it's advantageous for that restaurant owner to tell people to listen to your podcast because they're spotlighted, they're highlighted, and it's easy to share. Interviews are the fastest way to get your podcast out there, especially if you've got, in the case of you've got a market and you're talking to this restaurant and this boutique shop and this owner, and that will get your name out there so fast in a condensed market. Interviews are just an incredible tool to get your name out there quickly.
Great. Yeah. You're hacking other people's audiences, basically.
That's basically what you're doing, and it works every single time.
Cool. I snuck another slide in on you. So this one is more, whenever we have a strategy like this, I like to kind of then tie it in. Our audience here is mostly KV Core users. And I was hoping to kind of, I have a few bullets here about how you would use the podcast to generate traffic and leads. And it's pretty simple. We talk about this all the time, embedding calls to action to specific URLs for our landing page, or using smart number text response codes. I was hoping maybe you could, I have this thing, it says, where do CTAs go? What are some tips for embedding those little commercials into the content?
So there's a couple of ways you can do it. First of all, every podcast, first and foremost, it's what I call housekeeping. Every podcast should end with housekeeping. And what that is the last 30 to 45 seconds of every podcast episode has, here's where you can find me. And this is a good place for you to say, hey, listen, subscribe to my podcast, give me a 5-star rating. You might hear other podcasts do that, but end with housekeeping and end with your specific call to action. End with, go to my website and download this free PDF. Go to my website to get this, whatever your specific call to action is, end every episode. And I will tell you this right now, I end every single episode with my call to action. And that has grown my email list. I mean, I don't have the exact number sitting in front of me, but I would say that is the way in which I've grown my email list the fastest, is just by putting that at the end of every podcast episode. Now, the other thing that you can do, and obviously for today's webinar, we won't get too much into the monetization and commercials, but the sort of the rule of thumb is that when you hear a commercial on a podcast, it is either a commercial for somebody else's stuff, meaning it's a commercial for American Express or LinkedIn or Casper mattresses, or it's a commercial for your stuff. So I recommend, if you're going to do a podcast, you can build a 30-second commercial for your stuff. So what this is basically a 30-second commercial for your call to action.
So I would do like, hey, looking for a great deal in Pinellas County, check out 727realestatedeals.com, which redirects to a KV4 landing page where they can opt in.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and don't overthink it, because what you can do with your podcast is, let's say, back to our example, you're interviewing, the great local restaurant owner, and halfway through that interview, you just say, hey, you know what? Jim, hold on just a second. I want to tell everybody about where you can find out real estate deals in Pinellas County. Go to 727realestatedeals.com, that sort of thing. And that's a very easy transition. And when you're doing it, it comes with that same authority, that same authenticity. So people are going to react to it quicker. So that's something that you can do in the middle of your podcast. You can do it the end with housekeeping, and nothing says you don't have to do it. You can do it at the beginning as well. You can do it at all three places in every episode, for that repetition and that consistency.
What about pre-recording it, or hiring somebody with a silky smooth voice like you to pre-record it and then splice it in later? Like, that's an option too?
Yeah, that's totally an option. And it's funny because I've actually done this for people where I will record a 30-second commercial for them, kind of get it sort of just right with the right call to action, the right urgency and things like that. And then it's done. And then it's basically a piece of audio that if you're doing your own editing, or if you've hired an editor to do it for you, they just splice it in kind of exactly like what you just said right here.
Great. Great. Yeah, I wanted to get that in there because, the big picture is this is not only going to generate direct referrals and warm leads in a few different ways. The first way is if you're interviewing business owners, you're going to be naturally talking to them about real estate and getting top of mind with them. You're going to hack their audience because they're going to send everybody your way. People are going to trust you based on your content. And then you have this direct way to just build your database out organically, because you're going to get a lot of free traffic through the podcast networks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, and go ahead.
I'm sorry, my brain's going. I'm thinking here. So you would want to probably name your podcast relevant to the local market, knowing that people are going to search Apple for St. Pete, Florida related podcasts or something.
Yeah, one of the things, a mistake that I see some podcasters make is they try to get a little too cute with their name, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think it's definitely a creative space, and you can do that. But if you're doing a podcast about St. Petersburg, Florida real estate, then not to make it super obvious, but calling it the St. Petersburg, Florida real estate podcast is exactly what I would call it, and I would make sure that you call it that before somebody else does, and of course you can always call it something like, Sunshine State Deals podcast or something like that. And then you have
living in Tampa,
right. Yeah. And you have the opportunity with every service, back to the Libsyn, whenever you set up your Libsyn, you actually type in the name of your podcast and the description. In the description, you can make sure that you put those keywords in there, like St. Petersburg or real estate or that sort of thing, that are going to help with search and are going to help with discovery. One final thing I just want to throw in there, which I notice is becoming more and more important, is make sure your name is in not just the description, but as the author of the podcast, which always comes in from like Libsyn and with every episode. Because oftentimes if people, they hear your name, they hear, my name or your name, they'll search the name first. Oh, I heard, Joe Smith's podcast. So putting your name in there actually helps with search and discoverability. And it also helps with search and discoverability because as podcasts are growing, you are finding that you might have, one of my clients has a podcast called The Rabbit Hole. Well, there's 10 different podcasts called The Rabbit Hole. They're software engineers, and there's a New York Times podcast, both called The Rabbit Hole. So by putting your name in there, it's going to make for easier search and discoverability.
Got it. Great. Does anybody listening have any questions or feedback on this? Let us know what you think of the idea. I will mention, I'm thinking here as we record this, that we don't have a podcast really for Inside Real Estate, but I could see taking this episode, doing a webinar like this, and you could kind of repurpose content, use it both ways, right? So you could record it on a Zoom and then put it on your podcast and, and put it out there as a webinar, the stuff we've been talking about recently.
Yeah. And there's really, I mean, as much as there's, structure as it relates to podcasts and things like that. I mean, the rules are what you want to make them. So exactly. I've done that before. I've done plenty of webinars and then just said, hey, this was a good webinar. It's not a private webinar. And I just took the audio. I did a 30-second introduction, like, hey, we did this great webinar last week. Here's the audio from it. You lose a little bit of translation, if we're talking about pointing to visual slides and such, but nobody's going to fault you for that.
I've done in my own, I was referencing URLs on my website because the nature of mine was that I wanted people to look at examples. So you could always do that too.
Right.
I got a couple good questions. Joanna has a podcast. It's kind of a lifestyle podcast she shared here. I'll share it on the screen. And she's asking, would you start a totally new one if you're going to kind of try to involve real estate, or would you kind of try to merge the real estate stuff into this?
If you're already doing it, I think okay. So, and this is the podcast. I mean, you're using Anchor, so it was probably very easy for you to set up. That's a great question. If you've got the bandwidth to do another one specifically around real estate, that's not a bad idea. What I would say though is just like a lot of things in marketing, the more niche specific, the better. So with that, doing something that is real estate specific it's just going to give it an opportunity to grow more. That said, if you've already got established and you've already got listeners, you can just then, start to add real estate into it. I don't, and it's funny because I see both sides of this. I think the bottom line, if I had to pick one, I would do a specific real estate podcast if you have the bandwidth.
And you could use the other one so you can plug the two between each other. You can mention.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've had 2 podcasts in the past and I just use them to promote one another. And it's funny because they both grow.
Gotcha. Mike's asking, what's your feelings of doing a video podcast and split out the audio? Kind of what we were just saying. So you on purpose for video.
Yeah. And I think if you're doing something specifically like because I've worked with YouTubers in the past who are trying to get into podcast, just the quick and dirty method, take the audio and publish it into a podcast. And I see people do that all the time. I also see the other way around. And it's kind of quick and dirty, but if somebody's got, 30 minutes of audio in their podcast, they'll upload it to YouTube and just put a still image. And then that still image just exists for the time there. And that's really impressing upon somebody that they are using YouTube as a listening device. And that's really something where, you can do that. Again, there's no rules to say that you can't or cannot do it. The one thing about podcast as it relates to this conversation is really about the way people consume audio in a podcast using a podcast app, as opposed to YouTube, which is, again, nothing wrong with it, but unless you're paying for a YouTube subscription, as soon as you close your phone, if you're walking around or driving around, it shuts off the audio. What do you have up on the screen, Ryan?
I intentionally muted myself to get rid of that commercial, but I was showing an example of a podcast I listened to that it's a podcast first, but I consume it all on YouTube. And he basically just puts what you were talking about here, a picture of the guest, like that. So yeah, it can work both ways.
Yeah, it can work both ways. And what if I'm working with a YouTuber, I will definitely talk to a YouTuber about just, keep it dirty, keep it simple, keep it easy, but it works the other way around, just doing something like this. And really it's back to what I said on that one slide. You're opening up your real estate business to now be on YouTube or now to be on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Great. Susan was asking, is your podcast only audio or video too? Mine is just audio right now, with videos supplemented on a website that I tell people to go check out. Michael, what do you do?
I only do audio right now. And what I do and what I tend to, for my clients that I work one-on-one with, is I always just say, those are the quick and dirty ways to do it. But what you can do is go audio through podcast, sort of traditional audio podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcast, et cetera, but then use YouTube for something different. So what I do is I have a YouTube channel, but that's where I use for very specific resource videos and things like that. And I don't really push my YouTube nearly as hard as I push my podcast because I let my podcast sort of be the front door to my business. And as a podcast coach, that makes the most sense for me.
Great. So David's saying part-time agent. So he wants to kind of merge his content. He's a part-time agent, so he wants to ultimately be a coach, a business coach. So he's asking, what about something like a mentee podcast where he's learning from the interview? I think, Dave, what you're asking is, you could probably do that in a way that also helps your real estate business. Is that what you're getting at? I'm sure there are clever ways to do that, right, Michael? And this is where, having a strategy session, really talking about what your goals are, it's really important. But, when you're thinking about whatever it is, if you're a business coach who has a side business in real estate, just ask yourself, what is my end game? What is my goal? What do I want? Do I want warm leads? Do I want to make money? Do I want to sell a course? Do I want to sell homes? Whatever that real goal is, that's the North Star for your podcast. And then all the content sort of starts to build itself around that. Great. Mike's giving a tip. I do this all the time. I don't know if it works on iPhone too. He's saying you can basically keep listening to a YouTube over what you're doing on your phone. I think that's what you're saying, Mike, but I do that all the time where I'm reading my news and stuff and I have YouTube live and the headphones on and, everything else going on in the house.
Yeah. What I've found with YouTube, Yeah, I think this is still with this is that you have to pay for a premium if you want to shut your phone down and listen to it offline.
Yeah.
Whereas podcasts, all the podcast players, Apple and Spotify, they're a little like the actual interface is designed for you as a listener to be able to, listen, with your phone in your back pocket. You don't have to have it on.
I also learned that
So,
you can speed up the podcast recently, the audio of it. So you can do that.
yes,
Great.
a lot of people listen at 1.5, 2 times speed, things like that. So.
Yeah. Great. This
Hey,
is really
Ryan,
good, Michael. Go ahead.
hey, can you throw that last slide up there? I just want to make sure everybody knows about the free workshop.
Yeah. So guys, if you want, Michael it's an email based course, right? So,
yeah, basically it's a free 7-day, so you go to this link, and I set this up specifically for the Inside Real Estate group. You can go right there. And this basically will bring you right to this page. You drop in a email and your name at the bottom, and then you'll get an email every day for the next 7 days. So it's very simple. It's not like, hey, here's a bunch of information all at once. So it's kind of designed that, hey, this day you can think of, dive a little bit deeper into your podcast idea or goals, a little bit deeper into the studio equipment. And there's some extra links. There's a webinar on here that you'll get for avoiding common mistakes. So once you put in your email address and your name, you'll get an email right back to you with a link to a webinar that I did, probably the biggest webinar I've ever done. And it's really just about avoiding common mistakes that a lot of people do. So this is free information. It's all there. A lot of people will get this information, and it's literally enough to launch your own podcast. So please, by all means, go on there, grab that stuff, take it for free, and, let that be sort of an addition to what we talked about today.
Yeah. And if I can plug you at all, I could have definitely launched a podcast myself, but I wouldn't have. It was really useful to have you just kind of shortcutting everything for me as I went. So, if anybody is looking to really do this, Michael's a good guy to talk to.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that's really it. There's so much things. It's like I've learned a long time ago how many things in life you can do for free, especially with YouTube. You can Google everything, but the question is, will you do it? And so what I find is that most of the people I work with, it's the coaching aspect. It's you can do it, staying on task and things like that. But quite honestly, with the information that we've talked about today and with the 7-day podcast workshop, that gives you most, if not all, to kind of get your equipment set up, get the publishing right so that you could launch really fast.
Great. Thanks a lot, Michael. I plan to, and maybe Michael, I'll invite you to too. I plan to post more content like this to the Facebook group. We're also working on a project. We'll have a lot more content like this that you'll be learning about soon in a more organized kind of members area. But I'll be following up. I want to kind of record an episode. I might tap you, Michael, to help me structure it as an example. And we'd love to see what everybody else is doing. If you want to comment down below on YouTube, or if you're watching this in the Facebook group, let us know what you're doing with this idea too. Susan's asking for the equipment page. Can I just link to that here, Michael?
Yeah, if you want to just type it in, it's yourpodcastcoach.com.
Right.
And then studio checklist. So / studio checklist.
Sure. And you email this in that sequence too, right?
Yeah, it's in, and there's a couple of other things, but basically this is that page that we were talking about earlier. So the microphone, it looks like Amazon's got it priced at $53 today, but I tell you, if you Google that microphone right there, that's a microphone you actually see in a lot of big shows like American Idol, that sort of thing. That is a Shure SM48. You can find it actually for about $35, but this has the microphones, the cables, the USB interface. This is the USB interface that I believe you have, Ryan.
Yep. I got I have this one on the right, and then this interface. Yep.
Are you talking into that microphone right now?
Yep. Hope
Yep.
it sounds right.
Yeah. So it's funny. You're talking into that microphone, and I'm talking into the PR40 off to the left. But either way, those are really good microphones that allow you sort of that professional sound. And again, you can do it without breaking the bank.
Great. Yeah, this is really fun, Michael. Thanks for the positive feedback, everybody. I dropped the 2 links that Michael mentioned here. We'll get the replays up at, everywhere we put our replays. Definitely check out the Facebook group, insiderealestate.com/Facebook group. And we'll be back next Tuesday for our next session. So thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks again, Michael.
Hey, thanks everybody. Have a good day.
All right.